Mrs. Chavez, members of the council and guests, it's a privilege to welcome you to this evening's meeting. Allow me, before we begin, to thank the Baltimore Gas and Electric Company for sponsoring this evening's reception. Secondly, let me remind you of our next meeting of the council, which will be at the Harbor Court Hotel, with Clovis Maqsood, who is the chief representative of the Arab League to the United Nations and in the United States. We're here this evening, though, of course, to hear a foreign policy presentation by one of the two candidates for the United States Senate. The purpose of the council, of course, in inviting Mrs. Chavez and also in inviting Mrs. Mikulski, was to have an opportunity for as full a foreign policy statement as possible from each of the candidates on separate evenings, and then have the opportunity for a serious audience to ask questions concerning that position. Mrs. Chavez, as you all know, has had an active career in public life while at the same time raising her family. Her earliest work, in a sense, in Washington was as a member of the staff of the House Judiciary Committee. She then was editor of the American Education, which is the American Federation of Teachers' respected journal. She then was staff director of the United States Human Rights Commission, and from there assumed the position of director of the Office of Public Liaison in the Reagan administration. She served during that period of time as a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN Conference on Women in Nairobi, and she was also part of the Secretary of State's appointed commission to study the U.S. role in UNESCO. But now, and most importantly, she, of course, is candidate for the United States Senate. And again, we look forward to having an overview of her foreign policy positions, at which time we'll open the floor for questions, and we'll follow our usual procedure and end promptly by 7:10. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you the Republican candidate for the United States Senate, Mrs. Linda Chavez.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back again. I remember with some pleasure my last visit here, which was during the primary season when I participated in a debate on foreign policy issues. I had hoped that we might also have a debate in the general election season between my opponent and me to discuss what is clearly one of the two major areas of concern for the voters of Maryland. Since that was not possible, I'm happy to be here tonight to give you a chance to be able to ask me some questions. I have been here on other occasions and watched other panels, and I have learned that the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs is not shy in terms of asking people about their views. And so I don't think I need to bore you with a very long speech about what my views are. I think you'll probably be able to elicit those views better by getting a chance to ask me questions about what's on your mind. I thought I might just talk very briefly about what I consider to be three major areas of concern, in particular, three areas of concern for someone who wants to be a United States Senator in terms of U.S. foreign relations. The first being U.S.-Soviet relations, the second being arms reduction talks, and the third being the U.S.'s role in Central America. I think all of us watched with some sense of expectation when the president went to his meeting earlier this month with Secretary General Gorbachev in Iceland. I think many people believed that we would see out of those talks the second in what I assume will be a series of talks between our president and the head of the Soviet Union, and that we would see some agreement, particularly on the issue I think of most concern to people, and that is the issue of arms control. However, having been a part of the president's staff at the time of the original talks in Geneva, and having taken part in the preparation for those talks in terms of the preparation in the United States with dealing with various private organizations and how we attempted to promote what was the president's view and give a better sense of what the agenda was to be for those talks in Geneva. I know that despite the news media and others' belief that this was to be an arms reduction meeting, that there really were a series of items on the agenda in those discussions, including not only the bilateral relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also regional talks about the Soviet Union's activity in Afghanistan, in Central America, and elsewhere in the world. Also talks on human rights issues and the Soviet Union's own policy towards its own citizens, particularly focusing on such issues as Jewish emigration from the Soviet Union and what many people believe is repression within the Soviet Union, not just against Jews, but against others who wish to practice their religion. And the framework of the talks was always that they would include these other items in addition to any discussions on arms control. The administration pushed for a broader agenda because I think the administration believes, as do I, that our relations with the Soviet Union cut across all of these areas of concern. And our policy towards the Soviet Union encompasses not just our bilateral relations, in particular in the arms area, but also our sense of the Soviet Union's role in the world and the way in which the Soviet Union behaves towards other nations. I don't think it takes a very deep reading of history to understand that the Soviet Union has been an imperialist force in the world, and that there has been aggression on the part of the Soviet Union against other countries. The Soviet Union has expanded its empire since the revolution of 1917, and that expansion does in fact play a role in terms of our ability to live in the world with the Soviet Union at peace. And so I think the president, as would I, believes that some agreements must be made in terms of the Soviet Union's intention regarding its neighbors. After the invasion in Afghanistan, we took certain actions, not all of them productive in terms of moving the Soviet Union away from its policies. But I think since 1981, since Ronald Reagan became president, we have seen the Soviet Union less adventurous in its policies throughout the world. And I think a great deal of that has to do with the current administration's efforts to rebuild our military. If we can negotiate and deal with the Soviet Union from a position of strength, I think we will be more successful in keeping peace in the world. And that certainly encompasses my view. That view in terms of spending on national defense and spending for specific programs to modernize our military, including funding for an MX missile system that will allow us to compete with a much more advanced and new system in place in the Soviet Union, is, I think, a difference between myself and my opponent. My opponent does not, in fact, favor the MX missile, nor does she favor funding for such weapon systems as the B-1 bomber. I was, I think, as many people were, distressed in terms of the United States Congress, specifically the U.S. House of Representatives' role prior to the president's leaving for those talks in Iceland. I think we have had a history in this country throughout the decades of bipartisan support for whoever was the president at such time as that president went to meet with his counterpart of the Soviet Union. And regardless whether it was Republicans supporting John F. Kennedy or Democrats supporting Ronald Reagan, the history has been to try and coalesce behind the president in order to give him the authority to conduct foreign policy for our government. It is extraordinarily difficult in dealing with the Soviet Union, which is by and large monolithic, to have 535 separate voices trying to conduct foreign policy. And yet the House of Representatives, many Democrats in the House of Representatives, voted just prior to the president's leaving to go to Iceland to do things that I think would have restricted his ability, had they prevailed, in being able to negotiate meaningful arms reduction with the Soviet Union. I believe that most Americans, most Marylanders, and certainly I, favor allowing the president to conduct those negotiations and letting the president and his administration bringing back to the Senate of the United States whatever treaties have been signed in order for those treaties to be ratified. That was done with the SALT I agreement, it was done with the SALT II agreement, and frankly, the Congress, the Senate, decided in the SALT II treaty not to ratify it. I think that we still face the prospect of meaningful arms reduction during this administration. I think the president has shown himself willing to commit to reducing arms, but he has not been willing, as I don't think he should be, to compromise research and testing of strategic defense. Strategic defense is not something new in defense. The Soviet Union has been pursuing a ground-based strategic defense for more than a decade. They have in place a number of systems that are capable of intercepting incoming ICBMs after they re-enter the atmosphere. The difference between what the Soviet Union has been doing and what the United States proposes to do is in the basing of that system and in the technologies employed. And I think SDI offers a great prospect for the future in terms of protecting us against nuclear weapons, and may in fact not only lead to arms reductions, but may at some point, if it is fully deployed and fully effective, lead to nuclear weapons becoming obsolete. Finally, I'd like to just say a word about certain issues in this hemisphere and how I view U.S. foreign policy in Central America. I had occasion in 1980 to visit all of the countries of Central America except El Salvador on two separate occasions when I was an official of the American Federation of Teachers. My visits there were to meet with trade unionists in those countries and also to meet with government officials, and in one instance to meet with the head of state. I am amazed at what has happened in Central America in some of the countries that I visited from 1980 to the present. Costa Rica obviously had a thriving democracy of several decades at that time, and does to this day have that democracy, but it was almost unique in terms of the Central American countries. Guatemala and Honduras were both being run by non-democratic regimes. In one case, in the Guatemalan case, an authoritarian regime that was accused of severe human rights violations by some of the trade unionists that I met with when I was there. And Honduras had a more benevolent dictatorship, but certainly not a democratic government. El Salvador, which I did not visit, had gone through a series of coups, and a democracy was attempting to be born there. But that, of course, only occurred when Napoleon Duarte was elected, and has only really begun to have some real ground and some real roots in the last few years, and only after considerable assistance from the United States government, both military and humanitarian assistance. The one country that stands out as an exception to the trend that has been occurring in Central America is Nicaragua. I think I, along with a lot of Americans, saw the revolution in 1979 and the overthrow of Anastasio Somoza as a harbinger of good things for people of Nicaragua. I hoped, as I think many people did, that the people of Nicaragua, having been able to throw off a dictator, would now face the prospect of democracy. On the contrary, that is not what has happened. And in the years since 1979, the Sandinistas have basically moved closer and closer to the Soviet Union and to Cuba. They have begun to import enormous amounts of weapons, many of them offensive in nature, meant, I think, to pose a threat to their surrounding neighbors. They have declared their intention to expand their revolution throughout the hemisphere, and they have basically pushed out from their governing structures any moderate influences that participated in that revolution in 1979. U.S. policy since then, after having cut off our aid, which we were giving in the first 18 months of that Sandinista regime, has been to try and provide assistance, covert and direct, to those who are fighting against the regime. the Contras fighting from bases outside of Nicaragua. I support both military and economic assistance to those who are fighting against the regime. I do so because I think the regime in Nicaragua threatens not just the people of Nicaragua, but is a threat to the stability of the region. And I believe that that stability is important to the national security of our country, and that if we are concerned about Central America becoming communist and the Sandinistas being able to destabilize other budding democracies in the region, that we must support giving aid to those who would cause a countervailing pressure, those being the Contras. I would have voted for that aid had I been a member of Congress, and would, if elected, vote for continued assistance to those that are fighting against the Sandinistas. That, I think, gives you a sense of my views in certain areas, but I'm certainly happy to address foreign policy areas in other areas of the world. I'm happy to address any of your questions about anything that I've said or anything that I've left unsaid. Thank you very much. Now, don't prove me wrong by being bashful. Yes.
Ms. Chavez, last night the Japanese ambassador joined us, and he was talking on the various challenges we're having on trade issues. I'm not familiar with your interest and your feelings toward what the United States can do in its foreign relations with this trade imbalance we seem to be enduring.
Well, I think that there are a number of explanations and causes for the trade imbalance that we're experiencing. I don't think anybody is happy with the trade imbalance. Some of it has to do with the strength of the dollar. Other people believe that some of it has to do with the enormous deficit that we have in this country and what it has done to interest rates. There is certainly a case to be made that we are not as competitive as we might be. My basic philosophy in terms of trade is to support the notion of free trade. I think free trade has been important to the stability of the world since World War II. And I would like to continue a policy that is basically free trade oriented. But I'd like to add some caveats to that, because I think it's particularly in areas like ours, where we have lost an enormous number of jobs to overseas industry, that free trade basically means all sides playing by the same rules. And it is possible to have free trade only if that trade is also fair. I think the best way to overcome differences with our trading partners in terms of their practices, whether or not they're unfairly subsidizing industries, whether or not they're dumping goods here, whether or not they're closing off their markets to the United States and its goods, is by continued negotiations. And I think we've seen some progress. We've seen progress with the Japanese, we've seen progress with Canadians, our European trading partners, and others. I would pursue those talks through the GATT discussions, and I think that that is a far better alternative than passing protectionist legislation that ultimately, I think, could end up costing more jobs than it could possibly save. That was the experience in the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley legislation, and I think a far better approach is to negotiate with our trading partners to attempt to have them open up their markets to us and not to engage in practices that unfairly violate fair trade and free trade. When we do, in fact, believe that countries are acting unfairly and outside the bounds of our agreements, we have mechanisms within the trade laws, our own trade laws, to be able to retaliate. And I would not be opposed to the President retaliating when appropriate, when we have evidence that, in fact, countries are not abiding by our agreements. Yes?
Ms. Chavez, you just mentioned that you thought that Japan subsidizing their industries might be a cause for negotiations, if I heard you correctly. In that regard, can you explain maybe the difference between them subsidizing semiconductors and us subsidizing wheat?
Well, if you're talking about subsidizing wheat in terms of grain sales to such countries as the Soviet Union, I'm not in favor of selling subsidized wheat to the Soviet Union. I think it frankly doesn't make sense in terms of our overall relations with the Soviet Union and our foreign policy objectives, and I don't support those kinds of subsidies. There are different agreements based on commodities and based on what is being traded, and not precisely the same rules do not necessarily apply to each and every product or commodity. But if you're talking about us subsidizing, as was proposed, the grain that we were about to sell to the Soviet Union, I would not favor that. Yes.
Ms. Chavez, do you feel that the American government should do more to get Eugene Hasenfuss freed? And this is kind of a two-part. And also, are you in favor of committing American troops to Central America?
Well, both of those are sort of complicated questions. I think the U.S. government, as it should with any private citizen, should go through diplomatic channels and should attempt to protect the rights of all Americans. But whether Mr. Hasenfuss was violating our own laws, if he was engaged in an illegal private action, not sponsored by the government, I think makes it very difficult for the United States to do more than we are doing. Certainly, I think we ought to be exerting pressure in terms of freeing him, because it's very clear he's not going to get a free trial, fair trial, I should say, in Nicaragua. But I would treat his being held as I would any instance of an American abroad who may not be subject to the same kind of sense of justice as we have in this country. In terms of committing United States troops in Central America, I hope we won't see that day. I would never close off the possibility of U.S. troops being committed any place in the world if our national security is threatened. I think if you foreclose that possibility, you open up an invitation to other countries, aggressor nations, to make moves that simply blackmail us. If we're not willing to commit force when it's necessary to protect our own interests, then I think we are opening an invitation to others to take aggressive action against other countries and against our interests. I hope that by funding those in Nicaragua who are fighting against the regime there, to try and pressure that regime to change, to hold free and open elections, to quit attempting to export revolution throughout Central America, I'm hoping that that will preclude American troops ever having to be committed. But I think it would be unwise for anybody in a responsible position to say that they would never commit U.S. troops if it was in the interest of the United States and its national security to do so. Yes?
Firstly, I don't know which Dr. Bird or you that'll answer. I presume I'm correct in assuming we should find out questions in foreign affairs. Is that right?
Yes.
In that case, I have one question, not two. Clearly, one of the greatest threats in the area of foreign policy facing us today is that of international terrorism. I don't got to give you a quiz on that at WJC to prepare that, but you may not be aware, even you. A couple days ago, Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey began circulating a Dear Colleague letter on Capitol Hill, which would call on President Reagan, in light of the British evidence linking Syria to terrorism, to apply equal sanctions, the same sanctions we currently are applying against Libya to Syria. I'd like to know if you agree with that point. Perhaps if you could offer some insight why the administration seems to be treating Syria and Libya differently, and is this a good practice?
Well, I don't know what intelligence information we have that does in fact link Syria to that threatened bombing. It was actually, bombing never occurred because the British were able to detect the bomb before it was able to do damage on the airline, the LL airline in Heathrow Airport. But I do believe we ought to be consistent in our policies towards state-sponsored terrorism. In fact, early in the campaign, back in the primary season, I put out a position paper on terrorism. One of the things that I called for was to stop foreign aid going to countries that were responsible for state-sponsored terrorist acts. I think we have a considerable amount of evidence that Syria has been involved in training terrorists and that there has been Syrian involvement directly in acts of terrorism. If that is so, it would seem to me that we ought not to be directly or indirectly funding Syria. And yet my understanding is there is still a limited amount, not a large amount, but a limited amount of aid that finds its way to Syria. That would seem to me at the very first point to be a first step in taking against Syria. I've not been able to follow the newspaper as carefully the last couple of days as I might, but my recollection is that we have recalled our ambassador to Syria. And my guess is that we are now considering what further steps to take. I certainly don't think we need to consider the kind of attack that we made on Libya in terms of the bombing at this point. That was done because of a specific act of terrorism in which American lives were lost, and because we had direct and clear and irrefutable evidence that Libya was involved in that attack. But I think we ought not to have a double standard in terms of state-sponsored terrorism, and I would certainly consider the kind of approach that Senator Lautenberg has suggested.
If you're not in favor of protection, how do you propose that we get the international framework to buy our products, not just Japanese, but others?
Well, I think one of the reasons I'm not in favor of protectionism is I think that protectionist legislation might provoke a trade war that frankly would leave us in worse position than we are today. I think that a better approach is to continue talks and negotiations and to pressure our trading partners to open up their markets. They want to be able to sell their markets here. We have in the past been able to foster free trade through the negotiating process, and I think it's a better approach than imposing quotas or imposing tariffs that might provoke retaliation that ultimately will hurt the American consumer and may end up costing jobs because it will provoke retaliation by those countries that may cost us more jobs than the immediate effects of the legislation would save. Any other questions? Yes.
Why is it necessary, in light of our large budget deficit and our large debt, for us to spend nearly 50% of our defense budgets for the defense of the European community, when the European community doesn't spend anywhere near that amount for their own defense?
Well, if you talk to the Europeans, the Germans, for example, they will tell you that they have such things as a national draft, and that they would prefer that we had a system of draft as well, and they believe that they do provide for their own protection. But clearly we have an alliance with various of the European countries, and that alliance is based on our providing certain kinds of protections. I think it's not just done out of benevolence. It's not just done because we want to protect Europe from being overrun. I think we understand that if Europe were to fall to the Soviet Union, to the communists, that it would greatly alter our freedom in the world. And I believe that the amount of money we spend in terms of protecting our allies is important to the freedom of not only of the Europeans, but also to the future freedom of ourselves and future generations here. Yes.
Reverting to Nicaragua, my question is Nicaragua really a danger to the United States? We believe in the strength of democracy and the Western Alliance's powerful position. Is Nicaragua, if the United States didn't supply weapons to the Contras, and of course then there will not be any incentive for the Russians to do the same. Is Nicaragua really a danger to the United States?
Well, first of all, I think that misstates the chronology of how we got involved in aiding the Contras. We, in fact, did give, I'm having trouble recalling the exact figure, but I think it was about $180 million over the first 18 months or so. It may have been less than that, in aid to the new Sandinista regime. That was given during the Carter administration and carried on, I think, even maybe a month or so into the Reagan administration. That was given in the hopes that we would be able to bring the new Sandinista controlled government into our sphere of influence. In fact, that did not happen at the very time that we were supplying the Sandinistas with aid, economic aid and economic assistance. They were strengthening their ties to the Soviet Union, and they had begun by that time to import weapons. Now, some of the weapons that they've imported, including the largest tank force in all of Central America, exceeding even that of the Mexican, are not defensive weapons. These are offensive weapons. They are not weapons meant to protect the tiny country of Nicaragua from aggressors on the outside. They are weapons that are usually used in war as a weapon of offense. They have, as well as that, put in place airstrips that are capable of landing MiG aircraft, aircraft that would have the ability to reach targets in the United States. If you look at a map of Central America and you look at the placement of Nicaragua and you look at the capability given the newly improved Air Force of Nicaragua and the newly improved landing strips in Nicaragua, you find that Nicaragua is capable of threatening the sea lanes that are necessary to the protection of the United States, that are necessary to our ability to trade. They are capable of threatening the Panama Canal and the Caribbean basin, as well as the Pacific area, and would in fact impede our ability in a time of emergency to be able to respond as we can now. I think there's a big difference in terms of Nicaragua and its threat to us, even than there is in terms of Cuba, which is closer to our shores. And the difference is that Central America is part of the landmass that is our northern hemisphere. If Central America, if Nicaragua expands its revolution, and it is, it makes no secret about its intentions to do that. The Sandinistas say it over and over again publicly. They incorporate it into their announcements of plans every year. Daniel Ortega and others, Tomas Borge and others, have been very outspoken in indicating that they wish to expand their revolution throughout Central America. If that were to happen, I think it would destabilize Mexico, and I think it would drastically alter the United States in terms of our standing in the world. If Mexico were to become destabilized, sharing the long border that we do with Mexico, I think would make us have to pull back commitments in other places in the world. I can't imagine that if we are threatened at our southern flanks, that we're going to continue to be able to have American troops based in Korea or Europe or in the Middle East or any other place. It would drastically change the way in which we live, and I think that in order to prevent that, we would be better off pressuring the Sandinistas toward more freedom for their people and toward stopping exporting their revolution. Yes?
Linda, you suggested that we could possibly add. I think one of our underlying motives in Nicaragua is the fact that it's an illegitimate government. They got approval by the OAS to cut into the United Nations on the premise that they promised, I believe it was within 6 months, to hold fair and equal elections. They've never held those elections. And so in the eyes of the world, really, they are illegitimate.
Well, I think that's true, but there are many illegitimate governments in the world that we do not necessarily sponsor guerrilla movements against. I think the point you make is an important one, but I think the reason that we are fostering aid to the Contras who are fighting there has as much to do with their threat to us and to the stability of the hemisphere as it does to the illegitimacy of their government. Yes?
As Ms. Mikulski said, that the president passed up a great opportunity to isolate the peace. I'm sure the Kremlin sent her their thanks and gratitude. How do you react to that kind of
See, that wasn't a partisan question at all. Well, I think that both before and after Iceland, Barbara Mikulski has spoken out of both sides of her mouth. Certainly before the president went to Iceland and voting, she voted to not allow for funding of binary chemical weapons. She voted for forcing the president to sign a comprehensive test ban treaty. She voted for elimination of testing for anti-satellite weapons, and she voted for cuts in strategic defense. Those were four very important items that affected those talks in Iceland. To say that you support the president and wish him well, and then to tie at least one of his hands behind his back before he goes to the bargaining table, I think is a bit disingenuous. When we debated foreign policy issues 2 weeks ago out at Loyola College on a televised debate, if you'd listened to Barbara Mikulski, you would have thought that she had supported everything the president did in Iceland and wished him well, and wasn't going to attempt to second guess him. So I think she's been, depending on which audience she's been talking to, has been representing her views differently. I wish that we had been able to have a more lengthy debate on foreign policy issues in the course of this general election, as I wish that we had been able to debate some other issues. I think it's important to the voters of our state to get a sense of where each of us stands on the issues. Barbara Mikulski is perfectly free as an elected member of the House of Representatives to vote against funding for the MX missile or the B-1 bomb or any of the other weapon systems. What I find frustrating is that when she comes back to East Baltimore, you'd never have any idea that she voted the way she did. I think it's one thing to be someone like Michael Barnes, who votes the same way as she does, but at least Michael Barnes, in the times that I have debated with him on these issues, is very forthright in his explanations. I don't agree with them, but he at least is honest in telling people why it is he opposes such systems. What's frustrating with Ms. Mikulski is that you can't get her to admit that she actually voted the way she did, or to tell you why she did. The nearest we came to it was in the debate when she said she didn't like to vote for tanks that don't tank and subs that don't sub. That didn't give great insight into her thinking. Yeah.
There's one difference between you and the other candidate on foreign policy issues is that he speaks directly to us. And the other candidate speaks from 3x5 cards. Do you think that's a foreign policy difference?
Well, I don't know. Channel 13 here thought so. I was amused recently when meeting with the Washington Post in the editorial board meeting. We were talking about whether or not I supported the so-called Reagan doctrine of helping freedom fighters around the world. And I said yes, that I did. And someone said, well, does that mean that you support our funding of guerrilla movements in Angola? And I said, yes, I do. If you mean, do I support Jonas Savimbi and UNITA? And what's more, I even know who Jonas Savimbi is. I don't know how many of you remember it, but when Barbara Mikulski was asked a question about the African National Congress, she, who has been a very outspoken supporter of sanctions against South Africa and has said very flattering things about the ANC, she said that a man named not Jonas, but John Savimbi was the head of the ANC. I do think it's an issue that people who are elected to represent us in Congress and the United States Senate should be informed on the issues. I think there's been a tremendous tendency in the last 25 years for people who are elected to rely on their staff. If their staff doesn't give them a 3x5 card with all the relevant information on it, they may not be articulate on the issue. I know there are a lot of issues to learn about. I had to deal with everything from tax reform to SDI when I was in the White House. It took time and effort to learn some of the issues. I certainly was not an expert on the weapons of our country or on the tax code of our country. But I think when you want a job, if you want to represent people, you take the time and effort to learn. And you admit it when you don't know the answer to something rather than attempting to hide it in rhetorical responses.
What is your stand on the sanctions against the South African government?
I would have supported the president. I would not have voted to override his veto. I believe that the government in South Africa violates the human rights of the majority of South Africans. I believe that the apartheid system is abhorrent and ought to be abolished. And I believe that we should support efforts to try and pressure the South African government to come to terms with the majority of its population and to one day allow for one man, one vote and representation of all the rights, including protecting the minority rights of white South Africans. But I don't think that isolating South Africa in the way that the current legislation does is going to move us closer to that goal. In fact, I think it may have the opposite effect. There is tremendous tension going on in South Africa now. There are radical extremes of both the right and the left. The right, by and large, has the power in South Africa, has the weapons, the troops in South Africa. The left, on the other hand, has the numbers. And I think some of what we have been doing in terms of legislation to impose sanctions against South Africa may lead to greater bloodshed and may not bring us closer to a time when we see freedom for all South Africans. I would rather pursue a policy which did not try and isolate South Africa, but attempted to work with. I'm a little bit chagrined that some of the American companies, like General Motors and like Coca-Cola, have recently pulled out U.S. influence there. Now, in some cases, I guess they've turned it over to locally owned subsidiaries. But frankly, I think that the Sullivan Principles and U.S. Companies there have been a very important agent of social change. And I would prefer us to see us involved in that way than simply pulling out and allowing the kind of bloodshed we've been seeing in recent months continue and perhaps escalate. Yes?
Are you concerned about the next move that Gaddafi may make legitimately as a result of?
This does exactly what was behind the so-called disinformation campaign. If it was a disinformation campaign by our government, I adamantly oppose it. I think it's a disservice not just to the American people. I think it undermines our credibility with our allies and others in the world. We criticize the Soviet Union all the time for disinformation, and it makes us more vulnerable when we also engage in those tactics. So I'm opposed to any attempt to deceive Mr. Gaddafi by deceiving the American public. I don't think that's the best way to go about it, and very counterproductive. I don't know that Muammar Gaddafi is going to use that as an excuse to retaliate. It would seem that the situation in Libya right now is fairly unstable, and it's hard to know exactly whether how much power he has and whether he's been able to reconsolidate that power following the bombing. So I think it's very difficult without access to intelligence information, which if we did have access to, we wouldn't discuss here anyway, to know exactly what's going on or what his next moves are going to be. Yes?
Terrorism and foreign policy obviously are very closely related, and successive U.S. governments unfortunately tend to be harsh on some countries like Libya or perhaps Syria, but are very ginger in dealing with the principle who stands behind all of this, and that's the Soviet Union. We all know that the terrorism originates from there and is ideologically, materially, and otherwise supported through the Soviet Union and the satellites in Eastern Europe. And I would like to know if you were in the Congress, if you would be willing to take, or in the Senate, to take measures against the Soviet Union and countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, which support terrorism by providing training, weapons, etc.
Yes, I would, depending on what those moves were. I think it would not be smart for us to engage in bombing raids as we did against Libya. And I think all of these actions have to be taken with some consideration of what the response would be. It is international relations don't occur with just one party. You have to expect what response is going to be come out of any action that we take. But yes, I believe particularly taking a look at such things as most favored nation status to countries. The country is funding terrorist movements that end up killing Americans, that end up terrorizing not just our country but other nations. Then I don't know that we can abide by civilized dealings in such areas as trade. So I would condition our relations with other nations based on what role they play in sponsoring, training, and funding of terrorist activities. Yes.
Ms. Chavez, I wonder if there's any position that the president has taken that you disagree with.
In foreign relations, foreign policy?
Yes, in foreign policy.
Well, I would have, I think, been a little bit more aggressive in terms of South Africa and trying to get the South Africans to sit down and engage in meaningful negotiations with those parties within South Africa that are committed to democratic pluralism. I would prefer to see the kind of money that we are spending in terms of trying to bring Black South Africans to the United States, the money that was provided through the executive order signed last year, to be more focused and more directed, because I think just simply bringing people here to study in the United States may not really move us towards building the kind of institutions in South Africa that are necessary as a building block for democracy. Certainly, there may be various areas that we could go through if we went by country analysis where I might differ with one aspect or another in terms of the administration's foreign policy. I think, frankly, I have much closer agreement to the administration, more perfect agreement to with the administration on foreign policy and defense issues than I do on certain domestic issues. I am a believer in a great deal of what President Reagan has been able to do. I guess sometimes I feel he hasn't even been tough enough in certain areas, but I think it would be accurate to describe my views as conservative on foreign policy and in pretty close agreement with the President's. Yes?
On defense, I think you'll readily agree that there's been lots of controversy in this country on a lot of the issues which you talked about in terms of the next missile, in terms of the B-1 bomber, in terms of SDI, and concern and mixed feelings by lots of experts. I don't know what kind of expert you are on any of these, but my concern is where is your sense of discrimination? I have not heard you say about any defense issue, any defense piece of the budget that you would be against. It seems that you're very much in favor of either the MX missile, or the CX missile, or the TX missile, or anything coming down the line. And where does this fit in terms of relating defense policy to national budget priorities in terms of the national deficit? Where will you be on this?
Well, first of all, I'm clearly not an expert on defense issues. That doesn't mean that I'm not reasonably informed on them. I do support an MX missile. I support it because I look at the Soviet Union's arsenal and I see that they have several new weapon systems, some of them we believe in violation of SALT I and SALT II agreements. They have both a mobile rail system and a road mobile system that, frankly, without something like the MX, I think, does not allow us to have parity. We're dealing with an ICBM system prior to the MX that is nearly 20 years old. It's about 17 or 18 years old. I believe we do need to modernize that ICBM force. The controversy about the MX has had, by and large, to do with the basing of the system. Soviet Union doesn't have to worry about tearing up the forests of the Soviet Union or having an environmentalist lobby against the basing of the SSX-24, the SS-25. We do in this country have to deal with those domestic concerns, and most of the controversy has not been specifically related to the need for a new ICBM. It has had more to do with how that system would be based and whether or not we could base it in existing silos or whether or not we were going to put it in a mobile system that would cause problems for those states where we might place the system. I do have concerns about ever-escalating defense spending. I would, as somebody who believes in responsible fiscal restraint, take a look at the defense budget. I think there are a number of things that we can do to keep defense spending down while still meeting our national security needs. The Packard Commission, made up of people far more expert than I, recommended several things, including better procurement policies, an actual officer within the Department of Defense who would be in charge of procurement, going to a 2-year budget system, allowing for a 5-year strategic plan. All of those things, I think, could help keep down costs, would make us better prepared, and would provide savings over the long run. But I don't think that being opposed to a new strategic bomber like the B-1 or being opposed to a new ICBM like the MX is in the national security interests of our country. Yes, in the back.
After 40 years, do you think it's time to let Japan defend itself? I think they can afford it. And also, bring the troops home from Germany, let the European use their own forces.
I'm not in favor of
defense missiles and protect Europe from home.
I am not in favor of bringing the troops home from Europe. I'm in favor of our forces there. And in terms of Japan, I think we ought to be pressuring them to spend more on defense. Let's see, somebody maybe who hasn't asked a question yet. Yes?
Okay,
Oops, no. after you take it.
Given the history of trade embargoes, which have been variously described as shooting ourselves in the foot, do you consider that trade embargoes, especially in agricultural commodities, are a total foreign policy?
Well, I think the problem with trade embargoes, particularly if they affect only one area like agriculture, is the wheat embargo. There's certainly not a lot of equity in that. If we're going to embargo trade because we object to the foreign policy of one of our partners or one of our adversaries, as we did with the Soviet Union, it would seem to me that that embargo ought to be across the board and not geared towards just one segment of the economy. Yes, ma'am. Unless that was your question.
Yeah, I was wondering if the ANC is truly representative of the majority in South Africa, and if possibly they're getting any funding from the Soviet Union.
Well, there are certainly, I think, admittedly, people on the African National Congress Governing Board who are admitted communists, allied to the Soviet Union. The debate is not whether or not there are any communists in the ANC. The debate is whether or not they control the ANC, and how many of them there are in that governing board. And you hear various estimates of how many there are. The problem is, in terms of past history, there were not all of the Sandinistas who came to power in Nicaragua were communists, but there were a significant number of them, and when they did come to power, they were able to force out democratic elements, social democrats, Christian democrats, and others. And that has been the nature of some of the guerrilla movements where communists have played a major role, has been to simply, once they come to power, to subvert the interest of the democratic elements within the organization. I don't think that anybody would maintain that the ANC is in some way totally representative of black South Africans. There are certainly alternative power bases there. Chief Buthelezi, representing KwaZulus, certainly has a large base of support in South Africa, and I'm sure there are others who represent diverse elements within black South Africa. When I say I want negotiations to take place with those who are committed to democratic pluralism, I do not mean sitting down and negotiating with communists. Yes?
You talk a lot about Central America where there's a crisis. What would you do with the other Latin American countries, South America and Mexico, for example, where you have democracies and where you have severe financial problems? How would you help alleviate, or would you help alleviate their debt crisis?
Well, it's clear that Mexico and much of the third world that is indebted to the United States, banks, is unable to pay off its loans. Again, I think the question is how you stretch out those payments, whether or not you forgive some, whether or not you lower interest. I think there are various approaches. I'm not expert enough to know which of the approaches is the best, but clearly we're going to have to do something to alleviate what is a real burden in terms of those countries, and if they're not able to pay and we simply allow them to default, we suffer here in terms of our own banking industry and ultimately our own economy. So we've got to come to terms with some method of allowing them to pay back those loans, either over a more protracted period of time or at lower rates, or possibly forgiving some of them. Yes?
Would you favor building up our conventional forces, instituting a draft in exchange for getting rid of nuclear weapons?
That's not necessarily a question I would be prepared to answer at this point. I certainly would favor a draft at such point as it was necessary to get ourselves involved in the conflict. If our national security requires us to have a draft, that's why we have a registration for a draft. I'm not unalterably opposed to a draft. Whether we should trade nuclear weapons for more conventional forces, I think is open to question. There are some people who believe that nuclear weapons have in fact kept us out of war for the longest period in modern history in terms of a worldwide conflict. The deterrence and strength have kept us from getting involved since the stakes are so much higher. But whether that would be an appropriate trade is not a question I will answer right now. One more. Last question. Yes.
I know you proposed a firm domestic policy for dealing with drugs. In light of the fact that most of the drug problem originates abroad, what more can we do in the international arena to deal with the problem?
Well, we can do a lot. I think we did something this year with some limited success in terms of providing military assistance to the Bolivian government to be able to crack down on drug fields in their own country. We give billions of dollars in foreign aid. Some of it goes to countries that in turn export illegal drugs to the United States. I think we ought to be evaluating whether those countries are making honest, sincere efforts to crack down on the exporting of those illegal drugs. And we ought to base some of our foreign aid commitments on whether or not they are making those efforts. That's certainly a quota that I would support, making sure that they meet a commitment to lowering the export of illegal drugs to this country. It's something that we can monitor, I would condition our foreign aid, continued foreign aid, on countries cracking down on illegal drugs and their export to the U.S. Thank you all very much.
This council is engaged in a very modest enterprise, which simply is education and the discussion of public affairs, specifically foreign policy. And obviously its philosophy is that discussions over a long period of time gradually enhance the public understanding and then somehow, perhaps, enable our public actions to be more successful and better grounded. Your interests right now, perhaps, are in an election coming up and having an impact upon the voters. The interests of this council are somewhat different. I think that to have a candidate such as yourself present herself for an hour's time and disclose her mode of thinking and her analysis for everyone to carefully look at is a courageous thing to do. And it's constructive, I think, from the viewpoint of the council and an aid to our public discussion. I personally found tonight's program intellectually interesting. The questions, I think, were good, and it was interesting to see how you chose to answer. So for making a contribution to the direction that this council attempts to go, all of us are indebted to you. And we wish you well in your professional pursuits, and we thank you for contributing to the well-being of this organization.